I want to begin with acknowledging and paying my respects to the first Australians on whose lands we're meeting. We're here in Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands in Canberra. There are, of course, paying respects to elders past and present and who are joining us online from different countries and lands across the country. A very important year for Indigenous Australians as we go to the referendum on the 14th of October, voting for a voice to Parliament for First Nations Australians. A very, very important time to give voice to Indigenous Australians. So I'm Sharon Friel, welcome to Saving the World webinar series, coming to you from the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse, which is part of the ARC Laureate Fellowship Initiative on Governance for Planetary Health Equity here in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the ANU. And I'm joined today with my great colleague Megan Arthur, who's one of the Laureate Research Fellows. And as you know, each month we're joined by a fabulous speaker talking about different aspects of what we've been referring to as the consumptogenic system and its structural origins and what that means for climate change, inequality and health. And I'm really delighted today we're joined by Professor Robyn Ekersley, who's talking about disorder and injustice in a heating world. For those of you who don't know Robyn is the Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor in Political Science at the University of Melbourne, a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences here in Australia. And Robyn's work really is at the forefront of many of these big structural issues, and particularly as it relates to climate change and environmental degradation. She's published so widely environmental political theory, international relations, focus on democracy, the greening of states, and then that big the holy grail of governing of climate change. So we're going to hear from Robyn for about 25-30 minutes, and then Megan will give some remarks, and then we'll open up for discussion with you, the audience. So Robyn, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for, very much to Sharon and Megan for the invitation to talk to you. And I endorse your sentiments about the voice. So let me start by just explaining a little bit about the background of this paper. It was part of a special issue for the journal International Affairs, where a group of us were invited to explore the relationship between international order and international justice. And so anyone interested in reading the longer paper, it's in came out in issue 99, volume 99, issue number 1. So not all of you will be familiar with the preoccupations of international relations scholars. So I'll just start with a minute by explaining what our central interest is, which is the fact of societal multiplicity, the fact that we all live in different political communities. And we are focusing on how these communities relate to each other. That is the kind of distinctive object of inquiry of this particular field. Now, we can talk about relations between nations if we go back to nomadic hunter-gatherer societies, but to cut a long story short, those who examine international order look at the fundamental institutions that evolve over time to order relations between communities, nations, tribes, what have you. And today, of course, that system, that order is a system of sovereign states, and it's governed by the fundamental institution of multilateralism and diplomacy. And of course, this is a compensation for the fact that we don't have an international government. It's what enables international governance without international government. But the big debate in international relations today is, what is the future of the international order? The architecture of the liberal international order, which was sort of inaugurated at the end of the Second World War, is now challenged, particularly from the rise of China, but other major developing countries. the US is in relative decline, and there's this incredible uncertainty amongst international relations scholars as to how this order is going to unfold. Will it split into regions and so forth? So that's the big debate. So there are a lot of sources of instability for this international order, but it's now increasingly recognised that climate change is one such source of instability. But the problem is, I'm increasingly troubled by this framing, not for what it reveals, but rather for what it actually hides, such as who or what is actually doing the destabilising, and what is it that we actually need to stabilise. And these very fundamental questions are kind of kept under the carpet. Climate change is some kind of external threat to the order, as if the order has no role in the production of those threats. So I want to bring in the production of instability rather than just look at these as effects on the order, to try and get a better handle of that. And I want to do that by theorising order in relation to justice. So that's my purpose of this paper, and I'll speak to that. So let me start. When we think about how order and justice are understood in the international relations community, the dominant theory is realist, and that says that international order is a fundamental precondition for justice, and so it has priority. And they say that because you need to have a system that manages conflict, particularly amongst great powers, that will stabilise the order to enable debates about international justice, about which there is huge disagreement and much conflict, given the fact of pluralism. So this is kind of the dominant framing. Order exists before justice, and it's necessary to have a conversation about justice. I don't disagree with that claim per se, but it's incomplete. And it's incomplete in two particular ways. First, the understanding of order, which I'll unpack shortly, was not fashioned with challenges like global heating in mind. And once we start looking at that at an ontological level as a source of order, then everything starts to shift. So that's the first point. And the second point is that this account of order conveniently ignores how international orders produce injustices or constitute and maintain them. And that's really important if we want to understand our international climate regime and why it's underperforming. And that's because of the history of this order, particularly the imperial history of our order. And those legacies are still profoundly with us today. So they're my two big claims or problematics. So let's start with order. The account of international order as fundamentally a political order made up of certain rules and practices that stabilise relations between states. So it's kind of the meta order. We might take the UN, United Nations system, or the document that established that, as the closest thing we have to a quasi-constitution, and the international and multilateralism and diplomacy as the two main institutions. And the concept of juridical equality amongst all states with no higher authority. The problem is that masks the fact that there's no economic equality. There's a vastly unequal distribution of wealth, power, and opportunity amongst our states, which means the multilateral institution struggles to work. So most accounts of international order exist in splendid isolation from the socio-ecological relations and systems in which they're embedded and upon which they depend for their stability. And this is what gives rise to this rather misguided understanding of the causes and effects of instability. So global heating is framed as a source of instability, rather than the effects of international climate disordering practices that are condoned by the international economic order. So that might seem an obvious kind of thing, but it's not missing ontologically in the way IR scholars think about orders. So if you apply an ecological materialist perspective, we can see not just an ecological crisis, but an Earth systems crisis, a growth in what ecological Marxists call a harmful metabolic rift or rupture in the material and energetic metabolism or exchange between our socio-economic systems and the ecosystems and Earth systems in which we're embedded. that has benefited the few at the expense of the many. So what I want to offer is a kind of ecologically enlarged account of order that is inextricably linked to the production of injustices. So if you think of order at the most basic ontological level as a relatively stable and predictable system, then it necessarily follows that disorder occurs when that system becomes unpredictable and unstable. But most orders and systems are dynamic, and they can be made up of both ordering and disordering practices, and it's the balance of those that will characterize the nature of the order. We know that Earth systems are non-linear dynamical systems. We tend to think of political orders as relatively stable and they go through ruptures, but there's always ordering and disordering practices happening at the same time. And how we value them obviously is in the eyes of the beholder. Some systems can become self-disordering to the point where they literally become unstable and change and shift, either dramatically or slowly. So if we want to understand how this is happening at the moment in the current international order, we need to pass the international political order into some suborders. And if you take the international economic order as a suborder, and it's an order in the sense that it's made up of a collection of fundamental institutions united by certain principles and practices. The World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank are pretty fundamental. It was the old GATT that was part of the original Bretton Woods institution that's united around principles of economic liberalism that have become economic neoliberalism. And they established the rules of global commerce. And they're continuing to actively condone practices that are undermining Earth systems and ecosystems, and in unjust ways in terms of the effects. So you might say that we also have an international environmental order, particularly since the Earth Summit of 1992, where the environmental treaty system and the sustainable development goals and so forth are increasingly converging around a common set of principles, if not practices. But it's very much the poor relation to the international economic order. And its effects to kind of reorder, or rather prevent the disordering of ecosystems and Earth systems, is being overwhelmed by the disordering practices that are condoned, the ecologically disordering practices that are still condoned by the international economic order. So while all eyes are on the climate regime and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the now dead Kyoto Protocol, and now the alive and durable treaty that we have going forward, which is the Paris Agreement, it's always going to be deeply suboptimal until we see a shift in the international economic order. So let's now turn a little bit more closely as to how these injustices are being produced by the international order. If we have, again, an ecological materialist perspective here, we think of our material and energetic exchanges with the ecosystems in which we're embedded. Societies tend to organize these interactions via what I call different modes of provisioning. And these vary across space and time. And they give rise to different socio-ecological orders and different socio-ecological relations with different technology practices, different knowledges and identities, and understandings of our relationship to the more than human world. Now, the current provisioning order that we have is producing deepening contradictions between, as I said, economic ordering practices and their disordering effects on the climate system. And increasingly, there'll be both direct and indirect effects on the international economic system itself, and they're increasingly being recognised. But at the moment, we've got a system where it enables certain regions, certain classes, and certain countries to draw a much larger share of biophysical resources at the expense of others, by creating environmental sacrifice zones, exploiting certain forms of labour, marginalising certain communities, and inflicting a disproportionate share of risks and harms onto others. They're actually actively producing vulnerability, climate vulnerability. The ecological feminist Mary Mellor, in a different context, coined the phrase parasitical transcendence, and I think it really applies here. So some classes and regions can live at a level that can't be replicated across the board at the expense of other. Imperial orders are a classic example of a form of parasitical transcendence, and that legacy is still with us today in the current economic system. And of course, imperial orders didn't just colonize people, they colonized environments, and they gave rise to a kind of unequal, not just unequal economic exchange between the center and the periphery, but also unequal ecological exchange and unequal load displacement in terms of waste and so forth. And now we can see an unequal carbon exchange as well. And this is a very macro approach, as you can see. Now, when the negotiations started for the climate regime, beginning with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where the negotiations began back in 1990 and were concluded in 92, the parties couldn't agree on the polluter pays principle, but they did come to a compromise set of principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which picked up responsibility for the problem and also capacity to address the problem, and equity, which sort of hovered alongside those principles. And these principles held the promise of developing a form of affirmative multilateralism. We know affirmative action is very out of vogue these days, particularly in the US, but it was really emerging in this incipient regime in the early 90s. And this was acknowledging the world was made up of early and late developers. It acknowledged the unequal legacy of uneven and combined development and unequal carbon exchange, and which had enabled a massive wealth transfer to the global north at the expense of the global south. But this promise has not been fulfilled, and it's much more complicated now because we see a growing gap between the major emitters and the rest, and the major emitters, which are the US, EU, and the BRICS countries. It transcends the old global south, global north divide, so it's getting increasingly complicated. So, but what we see here is this growing division between major emitters and the most vulnerable countries, which represent about 48 states, representing about 1.2 billion people on the front line of climate change. And the central indignation here, the central injustice is that these vulnerable communities are the least responsible, the most exposed, and the least capable of adapting to climate change. This is a triple structural injustice, and it is produced by the international order rather than simply some source of security, that source of instability that's affecting the international order. So this might seem fairly obvious to an audience that's interested in equity and global health, but it is news to many significant international relations theorists. So to wind up this discussion, so we can have a bit of wind up my presentation so we can move to a discussion. It's a problem. The real political problem here is the inverse relationship between those who are most vulnerable and those with the capacity to change, and those that do have that capacity don't have the motivation to change, because it's going to demand a significant redistribution within the climate treaty, excuse me, through technology transfer and above all climate finance, and hopefully a big loss and damage fund that's being negotiated at the moment. But it's a real problem here, this inverse relationship. The most vulnerable groups, the Climate Vulnerable Forum, represented by the Climate Vulnerable Forum, has huge motivation. So they have to find ways of building support with well-wishers who do have capacity. But the irony is that because the most vulnerable are the most attentive to the future risks of runaway global heating, they're kind of the canaries in the coal mine. And the more that we're attentive to their needs and demands and focus on what we need to protect their communities, the more we're actually going to shore up the international order. But for that to happen, the international economic order is going to have to change, because only then can the Paris Agreement begin to really succeed. And by changes in the international economic order, I'm talking about bringing climate change right into the middle of the World Trade Organization, and also all the plurilateral trade negotiations that happen right into the bosom of the WTO and the IMF and other multilateral development banks, right into the center of aid, trade, and debt management. And only then can I see them working in harmony. So I'll stop at that point, and thank you very much.
Robyn, that was marvellous. Thank you so much. I don't know if, well, it's hard to see all of that, the clapping happening online, but really fantastic. Thank you. And I am it's so curious that, and so important that we have these cross-disciplinary discussions, isn't it? Because like you say, many of your remarks really sort of seem so true to what we do, certainly in the Hothouse, and I know for many of the colleagues that are online, you know, they'll certainly recognise the importance of what you're saying when it comes to global health inequities, and planetary health inequities, and it's so important that you're bringing that into the IR world, where often they are much more powerful than us in the public health world. So well, let me hand over to Megan, who'll give some remarks, then we'll open up for discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robyn, for the paper and for your talk today. I think it's really exciting, interesting, and I think incredibly useful for the work that we're trying to do as well. So yeah, I really appreciate the really kind of comprehensive conceptualization of these risks. And also, I think the space within that to see the opportunities for the international political order and economic order, and opportunities for change and transformation. So, and just I think this conceptualization of this problem of self-disordering orders, self-disordering systems, really struck me, and I just think is so incredibly useful and relevant in these times, obviously. So one thing I wanted to pick up on that I was really interested in your discussion and in your paper, as I understood it, is the imperative to address climate justice demands in order to, you know, attend to the canaries in the coal mine, as you say, to preserve states' legitimacy and that world order through attending to climate justice demands in order to lead to change and transformation. And so I guess I'm wondering about your perception, and for the discussion in general, kind of the potential for justice norms to serve as a potential lever for change and transformation within the current order. So for example, at the moment, I think there's been a request in to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, for an advisory opinion on states' obligations regarding climate change. So just thinking about different potential international avenues for these justice norms and potential for transformation, but also nationally, and then within those opportunities, or the opportunity for climate justice as a norm to kind of promote change nationally, I wonder about what institutional factors might facilitate that or constrain that. And this might link to, you know, your wider work around right-wing populism that you were mentioning that you're currently working on. And we've done a bit of work looking at the nationally determined contribution reports of national governments to the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so we've looked at, one of the things we've looked at within that is the extent to which countries use language of equity and justice in the sections of their reports focused on their mitigation policies. And we found that more frequent mentions of equity and justice related terms are correlated with countries with more democratic institutions. So it's a weak correlation, but there is an association there. So what are the kind of institutional factors nationally that may play a role in that, in the scope, I guess, for justice as a norm to contribute to change? The other aspect of justice that I wanted to kind of pick up on is dimensions of justice. So, you know, conceptualizations of justice in terms of distributive justice and equity within and between governance arenas, between jurisdictions, as well as between generations. So that distributive aspect of justice, but also the procedural aspect of justice as well, and kind of governance processes and equity within that side of things. So yeah, just really picking up on that focus on the imperative for climate justice as a potential legitimizing and kind of transformational norm, as a hopeful point, I guess, and an attempt to find kind of the opportunities and levers coming out of the work that you've done.
Sure, no, they're great questions, and thanks very much, Megan. The first one, I think we can run the argument, because I think it's a robust one, that justice is both necessary to legitimate change, because you have to think about justice, but it's also necessary for the reason that if we look after, if we address the climate injustices, we'll address the problem, literally. But that takes me directly to the dimensions of justice. And in political theory, we often think of justice. There was a big debate between Axel Honneth and Nancy Fraser that you may be aware of, where Honneth said the most fundamental injustice is lack of recognition, and Fraser said it's distribution, unfair distribution. And so there was this big debate about recognition and distribution. But both conceded the necessary norm, the procedural norm of participation, or consultation, deliberation, however you wish to cash that out. So since then, it's become more of an ecumenical debate that you need recognition, distribution, and participation. But there's further dimensions now, is that you need reparations, or there's restitution, or making good of the injustices that have happened. And this is now part of the loss and damage. And then you need a process, a just transition to get from where we are to a better place. And just transition principles, which are many and varied, the International Labour Organizations developed them, but they're mainly thinking about fossil fuel dependent communities and regions. But I think you need to think about just transition on a much broader plane. And what's interesting, the negotiators at COP28 in Dubai this year are starting a new dialogue on just transition. But there's been very little work on just transition. Most of the debates around the international climate negotiations have all been around CBDR, common but responsibility and capacity, and what is a just share of mitigation. But no one has looked at how do we fairly move beyond a fossil fuel global economy in a just way. The best that I've seen are some new just energy transition partnerships with South Africa, Senegal, Indonesia, and Vietnam, but they're just coalitions of the willing, led by wealthy donors that are getting something out of it. And it's not all, some of it's loans, some of it's very little of it is based on grants. So that's a big, wide open research field. What does global just transition mean? And what does that mean in health? Like if you have goal, I mean, it's really about how do you get from here to there? The transition path is the big burning political question. And with the work that's been done on regional just transitions, obviously consulting with those who are going to be affected is important. But because major wealthy fossil fuel interests are also affected, we can't treat them on the same plane as workers or local businesses or communities affected. And so those that are benefiting hugely from the incumbent industries can't be treated with kid gloves in this just transition. But that's exactly what's happened in the international regime. You might ask, why is fossil fuels hardly mentioned in any of the regimes? It's just not there. Well, OPEC had something to do with that. The only time it's mentioned is to look after countries that are dependent on fossil fuel with your climate policies. It's the opposite of what we want for just transition. It's been subverted. So we need to turn this around. And we have an important opportunity at the moment because the Labor government in Australia has announced that they're going to develop a new statutory authority called the Net Zero Authority. They've appointed Greg Combet as the interim director of an agency inside the government to develop the exposure legislation on this. So I'm now thinking about what can this authority do? And the government's clearly just thinking about coal-dependent regions where they want to kickstart a lot of renewable energy, and already the states are onto that. But I'm thinking this could be thought about in a much broader sense. What about people living in the outer suburbs who can only drive clunker cars and can't afford to retrofit their house and can't afford an EV? That should be part of just transition. How do we deal with the farmers who don't like these poles and wires going through their farming country, which is necessary for the new transition? What about those living in the critical mineral zones who are going to be affected, as they always are, and others? How do we manage this? Because that's where all the pointy politics is. And if we don't have both procedural and substantive principles of just transition to manage that, thinking of all those, so this is a kind of transitional justice. And this is where all the politics lies as well. And I think that's where, how do you transition towards better health incomes, health outcomes for more marginal communities? Where do you start, and what is the process? Because everything, if you have the wrong process, the politics will backfire and you lose time, and time's of the essence. And yet if we rush too much, we'll lose the politics as well, and things will fall over or they'll get repealed by the next government. So to finally finish up there, if you think about a lot of voters that support right-wing authoritarian populist leaders, if you can build decent, durable jobs in their regions, a lot of their grievances, because they're full of grievances, will be answered. They respond to people who tap into their grievances because it has this air of truthiness, because other people are ignoring their situation. And there might be an opioid epidemic. They're living in the old economy. If you can offer them decent work and recognize them, first principle of justice, you might be able to soften some of their hate towards cosmopolitan liberals who are interested in fancy climate policy that doesn't make any sense to them. So I think there's justice for those groups as well. And I'll finish with one little anecdote. I have a friend who runs an environmental justice clinic, and she does pro bono work for very poor communities in America. And she went to one of the Carolinas where there was this terrible chemical poisoning from these forever chemicals. And in this community, Donald Trump had sent in, because the water was unpotable, he'd sent in trucks of bottled water for them. But there were no environmental organizations to be seen. And I thought, Trump may be narcissistic and hateful, but he understands his community and he knows how to be seen there. And there should be other organizations in there working with them, and all they see is Trump. All they see is Trump caring for them. Well, other people, we need to care for those communities as well. That would be my last word here.
Robyn, you just reminded me, and then that we've got a couple of messages in the chat in the health world. I was just thinking of in Mexico, some of the kind of the big food companies, where the groups that were being seen in low-income neighborhoods who were bringing in water, they were bringing in access to foods for those communities, as well as at the same time bringing in the 2-litre bottles of soda. And there's been some really clever analysis done of looking at that sort of system as a contributor to driving childhood obesity in those communities. But it was absolutely because there was nothing else being offered to those communities. And so these companies stepped in to become in this instance, the nutrition, I put inverted commas, saviors. So I think, like you were saying with Trump, such an important lesson of, if there's a vacuum of support for those communities, then whoever comes in there gets absolute adoration. And we saw that with some of the COVID stuff. You did not use the words of the consumptogenic system, but what you've described really are those structural elements of what we talk about as the consumptogenic system of planetary health inequities. But just really, it's just so impressive listening to how you've described that international order and everything that's sort of happening within. So really a huge, huge thank you. Yes, and Megan, just marvellous reflections. Yeah, thank you. So we must finish, but we just starting to run over time. So please, colleagues, just join me in thanking Professor Robyn Ekersley, Megan Arthur, for you colleagues who have joined us online. Thank you to our marvellous project manager, Joss Cutler, who's in the background there, making sure all of this happens. And we don't have a Saving the World webinar next month, but we do have the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse inaugural annual policy symposium on the 13th of September, either in person here in Canberra or we are offering it online, an all-day event which really is going to pick up on a number of the issues that we've spoken about today, and of course in the other Saving the World webinars. I do hope you'll be able to join us